Ladies and gentlemen, your Artemis II crew.
This is an amazing opportunity, and it's an amazing time in history. We're sending people to the moon. I mean, getting people to the moon and back is a significant thing, and it's something we should celebrate. And when we announce the Artemis III crew or the Artemis IV crew, we'll be excited for that too, but this is a great time.
They could only be first one time. And after that, it's a job of work. And sadly, a lot of people don't remember the third man that walked on the moon, Pete Conrad. I remember, but that's part of history. That big event that causes all the excitement, that's the one they remember. And after that, it's routine. It's get back to work. So I think that's what you should expect.
Yeah, the flight rate is pretty low, and none of us will fly another Artemis mission likely, but it'll still be something to celebrate. And I'm just happy for our agencies and our countries that we get to be a part of this time right now.
Why don't you just jump there and land? Because Artemis 1 was a success. You need a lander.
It's not ready. The Orion capsule is how the humans, will get off the planet, get to lunar orbit, and get back to Earth. And that's the part we'll test on this mission. But the lander will be built by SpaceX. Starship is at least one of the landers that the United States is going to build, and that is what will take humans back down from lunar orbit to the surface of the moon.
The people who go on that first ride out around the moon are going to get a heck of a view, but they're not going to land. A lot of that will require Musk's SpaceX. If his big Starship doesn't pass muster here pretty soon, that's going to put a real block in the schedule.
Obviously, they still have a lot more work to do. There's some challenges there that they're going to have to work through. But what I would tell you is, we have multiple approaches. This isn't just a one-shot wonder. We're using different rockets, different infrastructure, different partnerships, and I think it's a smart approach.
Back to the moon and beyond.
Overall, it's incredible how everything was so successful and how all of the systems performed like they should have. And I got to give it to the Mission Control Center at Houston. What they did during those 20 plus days of the Artemis 1 was just incredible. They had to figure out lots of things that happened real time and how to keep going with the mission and how to execute all the mission objectives, and they did.
The Artemis 1 mission was intended as a kind of validation of concept, right? So we had the rocket, the spacecraft had some rudimentary life support systems on board, but not the full environmental control and life support.
It didn't have crew waste systems, it didn't have food systems, so it didn't have a lot of the things that we need to fly crew on board. It was really an engineering test of the spacecraft, the propulsion systems, the thermal protection system, the structures, the avionics. This is going to test also now the life support systems and all the environmental systems that needed to support our crew members.
We absolutely have lessons to work on. We have a lessons learned process going on right now that culminates from top to bottom. And we have a couple things that we're working on there, a couple boxes that operated a little bit differently than we expected. Never put the mission in jeopardy or missed a flight test objective. We have some work to do on the heat shield that we're trying to understand. So flawlessly, I would say, is a good word, but it doesn't mean without some things that we still need to look at and work on.
It's not that we're back to that old technology. It's you got to think about the requirements, the size of the vehicle, the weight of the vehicle, the speed we're coming back at. It's way faster than shuttle. The design just and the requirements drove you to a capsule, and those decisions were made a while back. But they went through multiple straight studies to figure out: is it better to do recovery as with a capsule with parachute? Is it better to do a recovery where you have a vehicle that lands flying into the atmosphere?
You need a force to slow you down, and if you're not using the atmosphere, then you need an engine or a rocket, and you need fuel for that. So if you take that fuel with you, then you're carrying that fuel all the way to the moon, and you're bringing it all the way back. That's the beauty of the direct entry, is you don't need that. You utilize the Earth's atmosphere to slow you down, and you don't carry any extra weight with you out to the moon.
SpaceX does land on the water, so they also made a decision, and they land also with parachutes with their human spacecraft, and they got there too. They decided this is probably based on our requirements, based on bringing the risk down, that this is the safest method to do it. Because some people do it different. You know, the commercial crew vehicle from Boeing actually lands on land with airbags that deploy before it. Soyuz lands on land, and right before it lands, it's the fire or thruster, but everybody actually uses parachutes. And why do we use parachutes? Because we found that it's the best way to slow the vehicle down. It's the best way to give us redundancy and risk. You can just see that every company, every government agency makes those trades and ends up making decisions based on their vehicle, what their requirements are, and what risk tolerance they're willing to accept.
The challenges of re-entering the atmosphere at our Mach 25, 11 kilometers per second, they haven't changed. And it turns out the shape of spacecraft, in order to efficiently and safely re-enter through the atmosphere at enormous speeds like that, capsule shapes are really optimized well for that. Maybe someday when much more advanced technologies allow airplanes to fly like Star Wars, we're a long way off from that.
The Orion spaceship is an expansion of Apollo, but it's not Apollo on steroids, as some people have said. It's using current technology to the best effect. It is a larger version of the Apollo design and planform, but it's pretty spacious, pretty nice, and the Apollo spacecraft was only about the size of a Volkswagen inside. That's about how much room they had to get around. This one is large and spacious. So, yeah, what it is basically all good stuff expanded.
I would say it's a very large SUV, perhaps. It's about 16 and a half feet at its widest point of the cone. Inside there's around 320 cubic feet of living space, so around 80 cubic feet per person. Imagine going on a long-haul road trip in a very large van.
It's bigger, heavier, more capability to carry a crew. So Apollo had 3, we're carrying 4 crew members. We can, for the further, the Artemis 3, 4, 5, the intent is to be able to carry 100 kilograms back from the lunar surface. Apollo started at maybe 20, 23, something like that, and ended up in the low 100s. So the capability to return science is pretty impressive with this Orion vehicle.
Compared to those early spacecraft like Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo, I think today's astronauts will feel it's a lot more roomy. They have a long mission to fly, a couple weeks out to the moon and back, and so as part of their health and comfort, you want to provide that space where they can be most efficient at the jobs they're asked to do. Looking at the cockpit itself, again, those old spacecraft had switches everywhere, hundreds of switches and dials in order to manually operate the systems. But with the software we have in the computers, we're able to automate that and collapse the control system to a much more concentrated and inefficient layout. So I would compare it more to like a modern commercial airliner than one of those old spacecraft. Starting at the top with the windows, the commander and pilot will sit side by side, and they have windows that allow them to look out. For example, when they need to rendezvous and dock and see the spacecraft they're approaching, they're able to look at both the instrument panel that's in front of them, as well as the windows that allow them to see outside. Now, below them in a 2x2 orientation is the mission specialists, and they'll be oriented in that configuration for launch and landing. But when they're not in that, they can move around, get out of their seats. There'll be 4 sleeping bags, and in the space station and other things, we allow the crews to sleep where they find it most comfortable. What you see before me, down here at the base of Orion, is the waste collection area. This is the toilet that the astronauts will use for their 3-week mission. Now, separately on a different part of the spacecraft is the food preparation area where they can get drinking water. And naturally, you want to separate where you eat and drink from the waste collection part. Right next to the hatch are these emergency systems. So there's a crew survival bag here, and there's a life raft on board. So in the unlikely event of a problem where the crew needs to get out quickly, you want your emergency supplies right by where you're gonna exit so they can quickly grab it and go outside. This is our external hatch. It's what protects the crew from the vacuum of space. It's an outward opening hatch, and so what you see oriented around it are latches. Basically keeps the hatch sealed against the pressure of the inside. So all these mechanisms are a way to keep the hatch closed, but also in the event of something really bad, can allow it to open very quickly. The next feature I want to point out is the tunnel that you see right behind me. This tunnel leads to a docking mechanism and a hatch, which once Orion docks to its next spacecraft, whether it's the human landing system or the Gateway outpost, it'll make a hard seal in between those spacecraft. The astronauts will float up through this tunnel, they'll remove that hatch, and they'll be able to transfer into their next vehicle.
This is one of the areas we've really benefited from through the shuttle and the International Space Station and the other programs. We've standardized docking mechanisms. The key is going to be to make sure that as we get those parts together, as we get the Orion capsule, and whether that's one lander or another, and I know there's 2 on contract right now, is to make sure the pressure differentials and the temperatures and everything, to make sure that as we open the hatch, everything goes well. The docking themselves is pretty standardized. It's really about making sure that what we would call interface control is done correctly.
On Artemis 1, fully autonomous mission control was operating the spacecraft from Houston. So on Artemis 2, we are going to take all of that into the crew's hands and make sure all the backup systems, the manual systems, work the way they should. So if we ever have an anomaly on future Artemis missions, we already know the crew knows how to maneuver the vehicle. They know how to work the communication systems, pointing,
get the optical comm system up and running. We know how to configure the cabin. So this will actually be a fairly manual hands-on flight. The mission itself is different because we want to do some things in a highly elliptic orbit before we commit to go to translunar injection. So there's about a 23.5-hour orbit that we place the spacecraft in to do checkouts of the ECLSS system, environmental control, and life support, to make sure that the ECLSS system can support 4 crew members, and they'll be doing exercise and trying to stress the ECLSS system in that 23.5-hour orbit. We'll also do a proximity operation where we have the crew members manually pilot the Orion spacecraft. We will have separated from that stage, and we'll do a docking maneuver around the spent stage. So it's really intended to bring out new capabilities that we didn't do on Artemis 1.
Whatever we learn from that, then they'll take those lessons and pull it in for our mission on Artemis 3. And once we get past Artemis 3, I really do believe the rest ones will be they could be as fast as we want them to be.
Ultimately, we need to get to a cadence that we're flying at least once a year, right? And that's on this. Recognize that there'll be a lot of other rockets that will be flying and staging things in space and all that. So we're not dependent on a cadence of flying every few months of a large rocket like this. And I think that's important too. It's a big rocket. It's intended to send big things deep in space.
We actually have hardware right now through Artemis 7. We have contracts through Artemis 9. So on paper, I'd say contracts through 9 and hardware through 7. So I think we're a very hardware-rich program. We'd like to have some more hardware in case we run into some problems along the way. But we're building stuff for Artemis 7 today, which is right now Artemis 7 is scheduled out in the 2030s. The first iteration of the SLS core stage is obviously focused on returning astronauts to the surface of the moon, which is a feat in and of itself. Beyond that, as I mentioned earlier, we are intending to go to stay. So to do that, we have upgraded variants of the SLS core stage, which have even to take us from a Block 1 to a Block 1B, which is the next step in advancement. It is an upgrade in the second stage propulsion system. The current for the Block 1, the propulsion system is powered by one engine, whereas the Block 1B will have upper stage with 4 engines. To take it from a Block 1B to a Block 2, which is the final of those evolvable states of this hardware, it takes us to about 120 metric ton payload capacity.
The core stage, being the backbone of the propulsion system for the entire vehicle, has approximately an 8-minute duration, and that is the lifespan from RS-25 engine ignition sequence to jettison from the upper stages of the vehicle itself, wherein it'll fall back to Earth and disassemble itself safely. Beyond that, the upper stages will continue on with the translunar injection and the different mission profiles.
The orange is the foam on it. It's an insulated foam. And if you look back to the beginning of the space shuttle program, we had a white tank, and that was just because we painted the foam. Well, we realized that the foam was capable of withstanding the environments, and that saves a lot of mass. You know, you were talking about thousands of pounds of paint. Well, if you're not carrying the paint, then you can be carrying other cargo.
Once the SLS core stage is completed here at the Michoud Assembly Facility in New Orleans, we have a floating barge dock at the facility where we load the core stage onto a purpose-built barge called Pegasus, and the barge takes a sea journey around the tip of Florida and to the East Coast at Cape Canaveral, where we offload at the Kennedy Space Center and transport the core stage into the vertical assembly building there at Kennedy for integration with the remainder of the rocket, the solid rocket boosters, as well as the Orion crew vehicle in preparation for launch.
Well, this is the spacecraft that's used to take men down to the lunar surface. And it's docked to the command module.
I went up to Grumman and took a course in the engineering of the lunar module very early on in the game. First of all, remember that Grumman built Navy fighter planes, things that don't land on decks, they crash. And the lunar module was built every bit as strong as any of their fighter planes. The framework, once you saw inside it, was amazing. The supporting structure went around like ribs, and the thing was really built to take punishment, but it was never built to fly in an atmosphere. So all they did was, once they got the structure, then they just hung sheet metal on it to cover it up.
If you look back at the Apollo landers, they were small, more fragile, and limited time on the moon. The landers that the Human Landing System program is working with contractors to build are those that are more sustainable, long-term, larger, more massive, and they are expected to be launched on other rockets and not concurrent with the crew.
Having a couple of companies is something that the government would have supported one way or another anyway. Having them build it up on their own, the very wealthy entrepreneurs, it's sort of unique. It's very probably a very American solution in a way, but it's not without its costs and potential future problems as well. SpaceX, for example, right now has proved themselves to be reliable. They are the major launch company in the United States. And of course, there's always the risk of monopoly power. Now, just being the only one right now that with a lot of capability is not necessarily bad. Let's see how competition and the situation develops over time. I don't want to make any predictions, but I think we need more than one reliable competitor if we're dealing with private companies in relation to the government.
We have 2 contracts for human landers right now. We have one with SpaceX and one with Blue Origin. We certainly picked SpaceX based on their plans and their capabilities. We have a number of major milestones they have to go through for us. They have to transfer the liquid cryogenic propellant between 2 ships. That's a critical test for us. Then they have to do an uncrewed demo, landing on the surface before even getting to a crew demo.
We want to make sure we have a solid approach for the moon. And so this gives us the opportunity, similar to how Commercial Crew, they were awarded 2 different providers. You know, at the time it was Boeing and SpaceX to take crew up to International Space Station. And at the time, you know, early on at that award, I would say NASA wasn't really sure who was probably going to be successful first. And we feel like this is a very similar path. We believe both will be successful, and you know, we just want to make sure we have somebody at the earliest time possible.
We don't have other plans, we don't have other budgets, we don't have other work going on in parallel. Our plan is to land with hopefully both of those contractors, and if it ends up being one of them, then that's who we'll go with, and we'll work with our schedule to adjust for it. But those are our only plans right now for landers.
The size of Starship is around 50 meters tall. The size of the Blue Moon lander is around 16 meters tall. The Starship has an elevator mechanism for the crew to descend to the lunar surface. whereas the Blue Moon lander has a ladder, more traditional in what we're used to seeing. They have different propellants. One's hydrogen, the Blue is hydrogen, and SpaceX is methane. In general, though, there's a lot of similarities. They both require multiple launches. The Blue Moon lander also requires propellant transfer and aggregation that occurs in halo orbit, whereas SpaceX is doing all that in low Earth orbit. We'll take Artemis 3, for example, which is the first moon landing at the South Pole. So what we will do is the HLS Starship will be the first to launch. There'll be a series of tanking operations. So SpaceX will send up a depot, which is very similar to your gas station. And then they will send up tanker flights. And those tanker flights will fill the depot full of propellant. Then we send the Starship. So the Starship then launches, it docks, and it performs propellant transfer.
We'll actually launch the lander first, and the lander will go up in both architectures and fuel through their cryogenic depots, and then the landers will go into orbit, into our near rectilinear halo orbit, this unique orbit around the moon. For Artemis 3, Orion will dock directly to the lander, and the lander will go down to the surface, come back up from the surface, Orion will come home. Future missions, the lander will go up and be serviced, be filled. We'll go to our Gateway, our lunar orbiting space station. Orion will go to Gateway, and the crew will transition into the lander, 2 of the crew, go down to the surface. The other 2 will wait up in Gateway and do science and experiments up there.
I remember people seeing this as a concept in the Apollo days. Space station that'll be in orbit around the moon as a staging base for anything you want to do in that neighborhood.
Well, the Gateway Outpost is currently planned to have a robotic arm, much like the current ISS space station. But the way we plan to help build the Gateway using Orion is to launch big pieces on the SLS rocket. Now, on the way to the moon, Orion will turn around, they'll grab those pieces, and they'll deliver it and dock it to the Gateway. So it's a kind of a piece-by-piece assembly approach.
It's likely that the moon itself and the space station orbiting it in the future will be the way stations, even fueling stations, for rockets that are on their way to Mars in the future.
That's another research platform outside of the Earth's magnetic field where we can really begin to study that deep space environment. Spending time at the Gateway is very similar to traveling to Mars. So we can begin to learn about how does food respond, how do pharmaceuticals respond, how do people respond for that kind of a trip.
It's maybe a 6-month transit out to Mars, let's say best case. We can actually simulate a Mars transit by putting a crew on Gateway for 6 months with the right logistics, and then send them down to the surface of the moon, let them operate for 30 days, come back to Gateway, stay there for 6 months, and then come home. It's like a Mars mission, and we can understand how our systems and how our humans operate after long exposure to space and then operating in a partial gravity environment on the moon.
Living in low Earth orbit on the International Space Station has taught us much about how the body responds to that. For instance, we learned that for longer stays in orbit, there are impacts to bone density and muscle retention. And if you ask someone to be in space for a long period of time and then start doing jobs, maybe on a surface of the moon or maybe even Mars at some point, we have to understand how their bodies responded to the time and space and what we can expect them reasonably to do once they're on the surface.
For the Artemis missions, our crew members will use different environments than they use just for the space station. So we'll probably still use the neutral buoyancy lab, but this time instead of for microgravity, we'll use it for 1/6 gravity, which is the lunar gravity. And we'll do that by adding additional weights to the suit to weigh you down on the bottom of the pool to mimic what 1/6G might feel like. We also might use Argos, which is the active response gravity offload system, which basically is a smart gimbaling system that can pick up 5/6 of your weight, so you can only feel that 1/6 gravity effect. There will be geology training, whether that astronaut's background happens to be in geology or another science, or it happens to be from a different area. We've got fundamentals training that we've already started giving to folks in the astronaut office, and definitely those kinds of field trips where you're practicing looking at Earth geological features and choosing what to sample and how to sample it using the tools that they'll have on the moon.
Yeah, I've actually been to the place where they train the Apollo landed missions. It's in Flagstaff, Arizona. So it's geologically active from a geological time frame. So that's where they'll learn how to use the hammers and the scoops, how to recover with the full suit on, how to recover a rock without tipping over. So it's going to be very different training for them.
Now, there is no perfect example of the moon here on Earth. The only place that's identical to the moon is the moon itself. But we can begin to show them the types of features that we would expect them to encounter on the moon. All of it is just to give them as much background knowledge as possible so that when they get there, they can go do that work and they're not caught off guard by what they're seeing.
So Apollo was trained in this facility, but all of that equipment has been sent out to museums, and so we don't have any of the computers or the mop-ups or the simulators left in this building. Everything is from scratch. This simulator specifically is for the training of the entire team as well as the crew. It's scalable so that it can be focused on specific events, or it can train the entire scenarios from ascent to lunar transit, and then as well as entry. For Artemis 2, which is primarily focused on SLS and Orion, the crew gets training on how to monitor the launch and respond to any contingencies that happen during that time. Once they're on orbit, they need to interact with the vehicle, understand what the software is doing, when they might need to intervene and be a part of the process for those operations in space. Of course, they need to learn to live in the Orion vehicle, and then when the mission is complete, learning how to make sure that they can safely re-enter the atmosphere, that their parachutes have deployed, and once they splash down in the water, how to power down the vehicle. It definitely gets more complex for Artemis 3 because we're adding the lunar lander, which has to go now undock from Orion, go down to the surface of the moon. Then we're adding the EVA, so they have to learn to do a spacewalk. They have to learn certain science skills so they can collect the right samples and gather the right data. And then they have to traverse safely back across the lunar surface, which also is something new and different. And then take off from the surface and re-rendezvous and dock again with the Orion. So from that perspective, it's definitely more dynamic, and there's a lot of additional training on top of it.
Apollo 17 flew a professional geologist astronaut, and prior to that, the astronauts were military. But all of those astronauts were given science training. They had hundreds, in some cases over 1,000 hours of geology, geoscience training to help educate them for the job we were asking them to do when they got to the surface of the moon. They understood that technology would advance at a pace they maybe didn't understand at all. And they knew that some of the samples they collected might be better analyzed with future capabilities. And so a set of samples were maintained in a sealed status and were not measured or opened or analyzed in any way. Recently, NASA has begun to look at some of those samples, in particular samples that we actually sealed.
Science in the very beginning of the human space program was not a big factor. Engineering was the big factor. And science was a hitchhiker on the way to the moon. They realized they had to do science on the moon. Could not be very easily explained why we were there. The fact that we're going back to the moon now just seems like it's all built up and it's time to do it.
We're going to the South Pole, where Apollo went to the equator, where there's more history of the universe captured at the South Pole. 3 billion years history at the equator, 4 to 4.5 billion at the South Pole. What we're looking for at the South Pole are the minerals that are there, the water ice. We want to understand, can we use that water ice? Can we use those minerals to learn to live off the land? That water ice gives us tremendous capability to split the hydrogen and oxygen, use it for power in fuel cells, to use the water itself in our life support systems.
That ice could record the history of the entire solar system evolution. And if we can access it and study it, now we're starting to talk about the Earth-Moon system and the history of humankind and life in general. That is basically the marker point for us to help understand everything we'll observe in the solar system.
The moon right now is a location for scientific and diplomatic endeavors. It's not clear if it's going to be economically useful, but that's what exploration is about. It might be useful. Whether or not there is something there that could make money, that would justify a completely private investment, that's still really unknown. There are speculations like mining helium-3 off the lunar surface. There are speculations about mining asteroids, but those things are still fairly far in the future.
NASA have really invested commercially in the moon. We have our services contracts. We have services for our landers. Similarly, we're not buying the spacesuits. We're buying a couple suits waiting in the lander for our crews to get into.
We have two different vendors that have been awarded that contract. So we have Axiom Space and then also Collins Aerospace. So they both have been awarded to provide suits to NASA, basically as a rental services. So you can kind of use it analog of renting a car. So you don't necessarily, when you fly to a new place, you don't buy a new car. When you get there, you can rent one. And so NASA will be doing something similar, and that will help reduce the cost for the government to be able to do the Artemis missions, and also help open up the commercial market for not just NASA and the government to use these spacesuits, but also commercial vendors can come in and use those spacesuits as well. Since Axiom and Collins will own the suit design, they'll own the suit hardware.
There's a different set of suits that the astronauts wear for liftoff and re-entry, but they're more focused on just providing pressure suits capability to keep them alive in the event of a problem. The different suits you need to explore the moon, it's a very dusty environment. Those will launch on the lander and be waiting for the crew once they get there.
Dust ended up being more of a significant problem in the Apollo program than it was initially thought to be. So the lunar dust is very sharp, so it's like minuscule glass pieces, because there is no erosion features on the lunar surface, so there is not wind that's making that dust not be nearly as abrasive like we're used to here on Earth.
They took their suits on and off inside their living habitat, so we recognize that there is the possibility to bring a good amount of dust into your living environment. In later Apollo missions, they began reporting that was irritating to them, to their eyes, to their breathing. So that's something we would want to try and minimize as much as possible.
With the lunar missions, even though they were only 3, 4, or 5 days, that lunar dust could get into the fabric and could start to abrade the fabric. The Apollo suits also use zippers and they use cables, and both those things, when you add dust to them, don't work very well. And so we need to have more dust-resistant designs that can handle that lunar dust over a long mission. So those suits were made for both in your capsule and also to go EVA. So they were both an intravehicular activity suit and an extravehicular activity suit, so they form both functions. One of the downsides of having a suit that does both functions and not to make it optimized is they didn't have a lot of mobility, especially in the lower torso, in the Apollo suits because it was a completely soft pressure garment. So you didn't have things like bearings and hard goods that help give some mobility back to the crew member. So that's why when you watch the Apollo missions, they bounced around on the lunar surface, they fell a lot, they couldn't get down to the surface to work with tools because their spacesuits weren't built to have that mobility in mind. Because you don't want to have some of those hard components in your suit when you're coming back to Earth and landing in the ocean, and that hard impact, you need your suit to protect you. So now we have suits that are optimized just for that EVA function, and so we can have more mobility. So the suits that are going to be built for the Artemis mission are going to have more mobility than Apollo. So they're going to be able to walk easier, kneel, squat, be able to do the geological science tasks that they're going to be asked to do during that mission more effectively and more efficiently. One of the big things about the Apollo missions and the Apollo spacesuits in particular is those suits were all custom for crew members, and they were specifically built for just those crew members and backups in mind. So there was usually 5 suits made for each seat, is what they said. So you had, for the current flight crew, a training suit, a backup suit, and your flight suit. And then your backup crew also had a flight suit and a training suit. And as the missions went on, each suit cost more and more, and you'd have to make all these different suits, and so it wasn't very economical. So really during shuttle, we started to make modular suits, and this also helped open up a bigger range of sizes that we can fit. And so now for the EMU that they use right now on the space station, you have different components, small, medium, large. You can mix and match and be able to fit a larger crew member and crew population, and we want to continue that for the Artemis missions.
We're looking to our partners to be innovative in their solutions and creation of things like suits and rovers and habitats and anything. So we have 2 companies that we're looking to help us with landing. We have multiple companies that are helping us build a gateway. NASA recognizes that if you try to go and explore space as an individual agency, it's probably going to be very difficult. That's why we have established the Artemis Accords, so that we can begin having conversations about how we work together, how our nations treat each other in space as we try to go do this bold endeavor together.
We're talking about that safe, transparent, peaceful, and prosperous exploration. And part of that is, number one, respecting historical sites. We feel it's very important to respect the Apollo sites and not disturb those for what they did for humanity. Secondly, we want to make sure that where we land, we also respect other folks' sites that have landed there. We certainly want to be respectful of the resources that are on the moon and not claim territory. That's one of the fundamental premises of the Artemis Accords.
China landed an uncrewed spacecraft on the far side of the moon. The successful mission elevates China's space-powered status in a global rush to the moon.
We're in a space race with China. I don't want China to get to the South Pole first with humans and then say, this is ours, stay out. Chinese have been operating a space station themselves for quite a while, and they've made great advances on the moon. So right away you have a competitive stage. I think that the Chinese are
give every indication of being extremely serious about what they're doing, that they have the technology, they know the technology, and they're using it full force.
Some people think that if we can cooperate in space, that will have a positive effect on political relationships. Really, it's the other way around. If there are a good political situation, then space becomes some way of marking that, commemorating it, demonstrating it. So if the political relationships are there, the space cooperation follows as a way of making that tangible and visible. If the political situation is not there, space cooperation simply is not going to occur.
On behalf of the United States and the American people, let me just tell you all how delighted we are and how pleased I am to be able to congratulate you on this momentous occasion.
At times, they've been very welcome competitors and very welcome partners in all of this. We've drifted out of that now. One of the breaking points, I think, within NASA was the price of rides on the Soyuz to the space station. The truth of the matter is, Russia could have kept us off the space station if they wanted to. But I did notice that the price of a seat for an American astronaut went up every time we flew it. That was not good in terms of goodwill between the two of us. It didn't help much. And when Musk came along with his spaceship that could transport American astronauts, it was a big relief.
Technically speaking, Russia is still very capable. And they have rockets, they have the capability to do things politically, economically. They're in a different position now. And of course, China has invested extremely fast and heavily into space technologies, is at today, anyway, our major competitor in moon programs.
We worked through space station in an era where the U.S. and Russia were tenuous at times, and we still continue to work together on that program. So that's when I think of times when you can rise above things to work together on goals. I think space and science is an area where we can do that. So it gives me hope that we can in the future.
The thing about the moon is it has many different price points. It has things that are really major, like pressurized rover, they're billions of dollars. It has things that are fairly small, fairly affordable, that a developing country can do.
When I think about how we cooperate with both other nations and companies, the word competition doesn't come to mind, but the word cooperation does. One of NASA's missions, stated missions, is actually enabling a space economy. And every time we do something, we enable a market, we create a market. Every time we take something that has never been done before and show that it is not only doable, but that there could be a market around it, that is a success for NASA.
It's always fun to think about the future, right? What our plans are right now is to begin placing hardware that we can reuse. We want to leave tools behind. We want to leave rovers on the surface that can explore when our astronauts are not there.
First landing, and then we go to Artemis 4, where we have Gateway in place, and it'll be our first mission where we land from Gateway, and we have 2 crews staying on Gateway doing the science that I mentioned. Then we'll go to Artemis 5, where our plans right now are to have our lunar terrain vehicle waiting for the crew on Artemis 5 as they come down from Gateway. That will allow them to go much further on the surface. And then we get onto Artemis 6, where we'll probably add the airlock to Gateway, which means we can do spacewalks from Gateway to do repairs or do science or enhance Gateway. Then we'll move on from there with our pressurized rover, which is basically the crew can drive about 20 kilometers on the surface in a shirt sleeve environment and do their spacewalks from there, place their science experiments, bring rocks back from a different place. And then we'll be going just about every year, where we'll eventually add a surface habitation capability. Eventually, after that, we're trying to get to 4 crews to stay for 30 days. I would love to see a complex of buildings that included a habitat, some manufacturing. Can we take the regolith and do something useful with it that we don't have to bring from Earth, that we can build maybe part of those habitats from that. So first is a good habitat. And then I think outside of that, it'll be the things that characterize any good civilization, which would include science, exploration, and would include art at the end of the day.
I think it'd be very similar to the Antarctic science bases, the various nations that have bases at Antarctica. And if we can come to a common agreement, the law that works in Antarctica ought to apply to the moon pretty well, I would think. So you probably have scattered bases among the competitors, and who knows, we might even have cooperation between them.
I think we're a few years from a lot of habitats on there. I know how difficult it is to get a lander and a rover down there, and RHAB, and I believe we have a tremendously capable team to do it.
And that might not be on the surface of the moon, that might be in orbit around the moon. That may be the jump-off point from which we leave to go to Mars. That's all part of this open concept of considerations we have to take into account, right?
I think people will be very fascinated by when we look at technologies such as nuclear thermal propulsion, and that is a deep space technology that NASA and industry partners are championing to be able to pilot our astronauts from the lunar exploration and lunar orbital launch pads that will orbit the moon to perhaps the surface of Mars or other heavenly bodies.
I've heard one of our senior leaders say, the destination may be the same, but we're different. Our technology has advanced, our surveillance has developed, and there's just more things to explore. And that's one reason that I believe that the moon mission is still a viable mission. The technical end of this isn't the same challenge that it was in the 1960s. Even today, launching a rocket does not have the reliability that getting on an airplane has become. Rockets do fail. Space is a harsh and rough environment. That's one of the things that makes it expensive. It isn't a question of whether we can. It is a question of when and how much money we invest in it.
I am confident when Christopher Columbus went and asked Queen Isabella for the money to send ships all the way around the world, that there were people that thought that was foolish. There's plenty of food, there's plenty of capability where they were. They could not envision the world that was opened up and the exploration that occurred after that first voyage. And similarly, I don't think our imagination is sufficient to imagine where we're headed in this great quest.
seconds from now, you'll see that clock stop. And at that time, the hydrogen team is going to discuss their plan with the launch director. They're still working on it.
It was a real threat. We had the launch commit criteria. Those are our requirements that we need to satisfy to be able to launch. If we are violating a launch commit criteria, we are not authorized to proceed.
We had some problems during the shuttle years. We solved those problems as well. In this particular case, with the Space Launch System, the Artemis 1 campaign, what you saw with hydrogen leaks was really the first time these two complex machines ever hooked up.
Engineers are asking for a little more time to get back with the launch director on a go-forward plan. We're standing by for that.
It's still all new hardware. So our understanding of the vehicle is there, but we have to be vigilant about building and operating this vehicle because now we have to bring these humans home safe.
Launch control with an update. Launch Director Charlie Blackwell Thompson has called a scrub of the attempt to launch of Artemis 1 and the Space Launch System with the Orion spacecraft.
Thing is, when you're standing on the shoulders of giants, don't try to dance. Don't do that. Just accept the gift you've been given and march on.
Holy smokes! Why are we at this little fragmentation of many sizes? Hey, Dave, how you doing? Hi, Jimmy. Right away, Houston. Vector good. Excellent. Victor. I hear you have good run.
December 19th. They rode inside a 5,000-degree fireball through the atmosphere of Earth, stowed in the spacecraft almost 250 pounds of the moon.
I was very unhappy about the ending of Apollo. I thought it should have continued at least until 20 flights that were originally scheduled. It was cut short, and President Nixon hung it mostly on the Vietnam War. When Eugene Cernan started to climb up the stairs to the lunar module at the end of Apollo 17, he made a small speech. He was expected to, but he emphasized that he expected that we'd be back. The fact that it's taken this long probably would have been very concerning to GE and everybody else involved in the program. It has taken far too long.
Symbol of mankind, and we can live in peace and harmony in the future.
We have to remember, why did we go to the moon in the first place? When we went to the moon in the first place, it was not because President Kennedy was a space enthusiast. He had a political problem. He had a Cold War competition between the Soviet Union and the West. And so there was an argument being made that developing countries should think about following the Soviet model. So in that competition, where the U.S., of course, was second in the Sputnik launch, was second after Yuri Gagarin, that President Kennedy had a larger geopolitical and symbolic problem. And therefore, if the U.S. was going to compete in the Cold War environment, it needed to show that it could compete against the Soviet Union in the most highly visible area, which was space. Once that was done in 1969, the Seymour missions ending in 1972, that political problem was gone.
To implant experimental probes.
The moon's a very valuable resource, and we were leaving it after we'd only just scratched the surface. It was kind of deflating, but I've never been able to understand how you can invest that much in time, energy, talent, and imagination, and suddenly just decide, well, that's enough. We don't need to carry on with what we've accomplished. We had accomplished a great deal. The lunar landings were the equivalent of our pyramids. It was an evolutionary change in humanity. We saw the world a lot differently after Apollo than we did before.
It's all about financial resources and political will. At that time, they had decided that those moon missions that they had budgeted for, that those were the ones that they were willing to expend the effort and the political will for in the Apollo program. And in fact, there were 2 flight sets that didn't fly. We did convert some flight sets in the Apollo-Soyuz program after that. But that would be the choice that they made in the early 1970s and even before that to slow the program down.
We had quite a hiatus in manned flight. They filled in with the Apollo-Soyuz mission and Skylab in between to fill that empty space. The American program has used spare parts and other pieces mercilessly. You take a look at Skylab, which was the hollowed-out third stage of a Saturn V rocket, and the front door was a Gemini door. The only thing of really original construction on Skylab was the solar observatory attached to the nose. The rest of it was known technology that came right out of the warehouses. NASA doesn't just stand by itself in projects. It has all kinds of people working on what-ifs.
As the last Apollo crew worked on the moon, the engineers on Earth prepared for tomorrow's day in space.
I have a model here of the space shuttle. As you see, it resembles a double-wing airplane on top of a propulsion system. System is going to be designed so all of the costly parts are reusable.
There were a lot of concepts being considered for the reusable space plane. I think even von Braun had some thoughts about that. So it did, and as NASA transitioned after Apollo ended, we transitioned into the shuttle and then launching for the first time in '81.
The Soviet Union went in a different direction after the loss of the Moon and the Apollo program. They focused on long-duration space stations because they had relatively inexpensive rockets to go to and from the station. The United States wanted to try to lower the cost of launch and to have more reusable vehicles, which led it to build the shuttle. There's a number of things one can talk about the shuttle, and a number of promises that some were achieved and many were not. But it was an effort to make space more routine.
I remember I was in the White House when President Nixon presented the first model of the space shuttle and the way it was going to look. He did a ceremony, and it was clear that the space shuttle that was intended to be the support for the space station, as it eventually came to be, had no job at that time, because the space station was a long way off, and they were not going to do the two at the same time. Budgetary problems, were immense. And so Nixon simply said, well, find jobs for it to do. Then it became a space truck, and it did some marvelous stuff.
It was at the beginning of the space shuttle program, and as the shuttles were being built in California and then transported to Florida or to other locations to do testing, they'd be transported on top of the 747. You can't make that flight in one big flight. Oftentimes when configuration, they would land at an airport, stay there overnight, and the public would have the opportunity to come see what the next exciting thing NASA was doing. As a kid, 6 years old, my dad's like, come on, let's go. The 747 was parked on the runway at the Denver airport. We parked outside the fence line, and I distinctly remember walking up to the fence line, barbed wire fence, in the high grass, looking across the runway and seeing an orbiter sitting on top of a 747. And I was just hooked from that point on.
The human spaceflight took different avenues. After Apollo, we worked through with the shuttle program, and the shuttle program really captured and flourished in low Earth orbit. And I think that's where NASA was wanting to do the microgravity research. And, you know, from that microgravity research, there are new medicines, there are new spin-offs that have come about that. In addition, we learned how to live and work in space. And that's really key, you know, before you can continue to go longer, let's say, on the lunar surface. So I think we've capitalized, and we definitely know how to live into low Earth orbit. And we're going to take that and springboard that into longer stays on the moon.
Over those 50 years, we learned how to work together. We learned how to build together. We learned how to explore together. And that's what puts us in a position where we're now ready to explore the moon for longer periods of time and starting to lay down infrastructure so that we can stay there.
The Apollo missions, when we first put men on the surface of the moon, represented, I would say, a hallmark of something that we didn't think was previously possible. So that was the first step to say, yes, we as a species are capable of doing this.
Columbia, this is Houston, ALS, over.
Past that point, the focus, certainly with NASA and with everybody who's been participating in this endeavor, has been to focus on how can we do that with longevity and with safety and with a purpose. And to that effect, the International Space Station, as well as the Space Shuttle, represented multiple decades worth of developing our flight technologies, our human capacities, and a number of other areas of research that are going to enable us to go to the moon and stay for the long term.
Ron McNair, and pilot Mike Smith, followed by Christopher Fowler, Feature in Space.
2 minutes and 55 seconds. External tank liquid oxygen pressurization began, and main engine purging was completed.
4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle. All we knew was what we needed to know, we thought. And all of a sudden, it all went up in flames. And so we get these lessons the hard way. I've been here to see through all of it, but I was surprised at the human reaction when they saw Challenger and other problems like Apollo 13. People found it hard to believe that NASA could fail in such a spectacular manner. It's a dangerous business.
every time we've had a major accident, it's usually because schedule pressure was playing some role in that, whether it's Challenger or Columbia or lesser-known robotic and unmanned programs. The schedule pressure on people can be very, very subtle but debilitating. People want to do a good job. They want to succeed. They want to work hard. But sometimes under that pressure, that leads to mistakes, even by the most well-intentioned of people. And so you have to be careful. It's a balance. How do you maintain that sense of urgency and focus without giving in to schedule pressure that causes people to make mistakes or cut corners that can result in tragedy?
We saw a couple of times when they got in a hurry what kind of problems it caused. The Apollo 1 fire, for instance. Apollo 13, somebody messed up the design in some of the electronics in the fuel system. If those things are caused by people in too much of a hurry, schedule pressure, yeah, probably. Challenger was a problem in pushing too hard. They should never have launched that day. And they were told they should never have launched that day. And they did it anyway. If they'd have waited a day, probably wouldn't have happened. So that's what happens when you get in a hurry. So if they want to take extra time, it's okay by me. I'll wait.
This is Artemis Launch Control. Launch Director Charlie Blackwell Thompson just called a scrub for the launch attempt today, the second launch attempt. The team now going into the cutoff procedure after being unable to resolve a hydrogen leak.
Crew safety is quintessential, and we have the crew as part of our control boards. We have the chief safety officer is a key part of our program, as well as what we call our chief engineer. And then there's a time to kind of go back and say, okay, let's look more fulsomely at this. How ready are we? How close are we on this? How do we understand our margins? And so all this test campaign is building up data that will help us later determine when we're ready to fly.
Sometimes when people say to me, well, we've been to the moon already, what's so hard? And my response is usually, well, maybe your grandfather went to the moon, but you haven't gone to the moon. What have you done? What have you demonstrated? And the people who know the most about spaceflight will not be telling you that this is easy.
Every mission is dangerous. That's a part of the risk, but NASA has a great process, and our industry and international partners have great processes for analyzing that risk, understanding it, and then making risk-informed decisions. So yes, we've got training, we've got evaluations to do, but we've got this amazing team that we're going to be working with, and when they're ready, and when our training is ready, and when the vehicles are ready, we'll go.
It's really hard to leave Earth's gravity, and the capabilities we've put in place do improve the information that we have, the telemetry, the monitoring of our systems. There are a lot of improvements in capabilities, but actually getting to the moon is just hard, and that's going to be that way for a while until there are significant steps in technological breakthroughs. We've only really been working at this for 60 years, so that's a pretty short time frame from a technology development perspective.
We've always had plans to be able to go back to the moon. There's a constant turn in NASA about thinking ahead, and there's different areas in NASA that are responsible for human exploration, Earth climate research, space station, and so there's always somebody working or thinking about what can we do in the future. And that happened during Apollo, it happened during the shuttle, it happened during the space station. It just takes sometimes a long time to see the execution and the effort that comes from those projects.
History proves that we have never lost by pressing the limits of our frontiers. First, for the coming decade, for the 1990s, space station freedom, our critical next step in all our space endeavors, and next, for the new century, back to the moon, back to the future, and this time, back to stay.
I think we've cataloged 50 different studies on going back. Efforts like the Vision for Space Exploration and the Space Exploration Initiative that were designed to take us back to the moon. And eventually those get, the political will drops off because it might be associated with a certain administration or a particular implementation.
Some of those earlier programs in the Space Exploration Initiative, it never really made as much progress to get near hardware. And the Congress looked at the price tag and just opposed it. So it was largely done and defeated within George H.W. Bush administration. The vision for space exploration got farther. In fact, there were several different elements, something called the Crew Exploration Vehicle, which is we now see as the Orion capsule. There were different rocket designs, Ares 1, Ares 5, that were developed. There was actually a test flight of Ares 1 in experimental mode. That program was canceled during the Obama administration. There is a heavy lift version called Ares 5, somewhat akin to a Saturn V class vehicle. That program didn't really have any hardware developed during the Bush administration, but it did continue into what we see today as the Space Launch System. So there are elements of the Vision for Space Exploration program, which was called Constellation, that did survive and are still with us today.
The shuttle wasn't able to return to the moon. It just wasn't designed for that mission. It wasn't designed for that kind of re-entry. And so subsequent to the shuttle, after that became the workhorse of the U.S. space industry, we looked at derivatives of the space shuttle that would be different. There was a thing called Shuttle C that looked at large cargo capability. That would have been the first machine that might have been capable of sending any measurable amount of mass to the moon. It would have still needed a capsule. You can see the development that started even in the Constellation program. That's the nearest program to the Space Launch System in the Artemis programs.
A lot of the capabilities that we have moving forward were generated out of the start of the Constellation program. And so when it was canceled, much of a lot of the things, especially related to Orion and our ground systems, so the launch pad, the mobile launcher, all translated directly into the path for Artemis. And so here we were able to just continue to work and evolve as the flight hardware evolved.
NASA's budget's kind of fixed. It's not, it's not like a DoD budget that's, covers a lot of different things. But I didn't feel like we were that well supported on the Constellation program. You got a lot of smart people, and a lot of the people that work Constellation are working Artemis now, and we had the talent. It just kind of fizzled towards the end. We had some leadership changes in the U.S. at that point in time, so there was a lot going on there. But I think the Artemis program has quite a bit more support in Congress and on the executive side.
NASA operated the shuttle for many years, and there were efforts to come up with a replacement in the 1990s. NASA chose some very high-risk designs. They didn't produce a lower technical risk evolving design that would look like maybe a shuttle Block 2. They proceeded with a program called X-33, which was a very advanced composite tanks, linear aerospike engines, all kinds of things on it. A very, very advanced piece of technology.
Years of hard work and determined leadership still ahead. This is the craft that can carry America's dreams aloft and launch our nation into a sparkling new century.
I think with the idea that if it didn't work, they could still fly the shuttle. Well, the problem is, it didn't work. We were still flying the shuttle, and then you had the accident occur in 2003. And we were done with production lines. We could not build a replacement orbiter if we wanted to. We couldn't keep flying the shuttle because plainly, even after certifying a return to flight, it's still a very dangerous vehicle. There was no way really to cure that. And so the program really needed to come to an end. And therefore, since you had not spent time earlier developing a new replacement, what you had to do is go with what parts and components you had. So, shuttle external tanks, shuttle solid rocket boosters, familiar engines. I look at SLS, I see something with a fairly high degree of technical inheritance and traceability back to earlier systems, because we had to go with what we had, not future systems that we might wish we had.
I believe that the architecture we have today, which is rooted in shuttle, is we're taking advantage of the investments that have been made. So Orion and what was Ares 1 and Ares 5 in Constellation, we learned a lot about the engineering and put a lot of investment in that engineering. So to use those, the evolution of those and the SLS and Orion directly, those capabilities, is taking advantage of an investment that you've already made. Yes, the SLS core stage has borrowed a lot of the concepts from the space shuttle as well as from Apollo, and for good reason. There are things that you don't want to forget in space flight, and when you have a vehicle that you know can fly successfully and safely, you want to take everything you can from that and lean into next-generation spacecraft development so that you don't miss anything in terms of capability and safety for the astronauts.
When you look at the configuration that we have from an SLS perspective, it is significantly different from shuttle. The shuttle orbiter really was the brains of that flight vehicle. So all of the avionics, all of that was managed by the shuttle orbiter. When you look at the way the SLS vehicle is configured, we have avionics for the upper stage. We have a brand new invention utilizing engines from the shuttle program. The RS-25, or the Space Shuttle Main Engine, is a very well-performing engine. The history of that says we needed to utilize something. We didn't necessarily need to go to a new engine. The solids are very much consistent, a little more thrust because of the added fifth segment. I think we came up with a very good solution based on where we had been. We took advantage of assets that we already had, such as the Space Shuttle main engines, the solid rocket booster casings, and stuff like that. And I think this really provides a more affordable version of what we're trying to do instead of developing an all-new rocket. And then we evolve that capability when we need it.
There's a lot of things that are new and different with this spacecraft and the launch system. While we're building off the heritage that we had during shuttle, for example, on the solid rocket boosters, we're flying much bigger solid rocket boosters that have very different chemical propellants in them. So again, everything is building off the heritage we have from before, and it's developing the new and moving us forward. It's all about escaping the Earth's velocity, right? We have to be at a certain speed
to get to orbit. You have to spend a lot of fuel to get to that speed. And depending on the payload mass that you're trying to put on orbit and what fuel is remaining that you need to get to the moon is what really drives the size of these vehicles. This is why the SLS is that big. This is why the Saturn V was that big. This is why the Starship is going to be that big and that powerful, because it really is sending a lot of weight.
The re-entry, direct re-entry back into Earth's atmosphere, utilizing the atmosphere to slow down, and then splash down in the Pacific under parachutes. So when you look at that configuration, they look similar, capsule-based configuration. It has everything to do with that mission profile, physics. This system is very similar from that standpoint of what we had during the Apollo program. And what it means is you have parasitic stages. They ride part of the way up. When they're not being used anymore, they're dropped off and they burn up, going re-enter into the atmosphere. There was a conscious decision not to recover the solid rocket boosters the way we did in Shuttle. And that conscious decision was payload. If you're recovering the boosters with parachutes or whatever, that's weight that you have to carry on the way up. With reusability comes a lot of expense as well.
The Apollo missions taught us much in terms of what aerospace and vehicles of that nature are capable of withstanding in terms of their performance capabilities, the structural rigidity required to escape Earth's gravity. So you'll see a lot of similarities in between the Apollo framework and the SLS. The fuel sources are different. The Apollo rocket had kerosene fueling the F-1 engines, whereas today on the Space Launch System we utilize liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen. But again, that is the culmination of building blocks from Apollo to the space shuttle to give us the capabilities that this rocket has that previous rockets didn't. So starting from the bottom of the SLS 4-stage, we have the engine section, which is where the 4 RS-25 engines are mounted, and that is by far and away the most complex portion in terms of propulsion systems, avionics systems, electrical controls, everything that we need to communicate with the engines to direct the vehicle where it needs to go on ascent. Just above that, we have the liquid hydrogen tank. That is the largest portion of the rocket by volume. It's 131 feet long, standalone. And that is, of course, the fuel source that we utilize for the RS-25 engines. Just above that is the intertank, which is the forwardmost attachment point for the solid rocket boosters. The 2 solid rocket boosters are solid propellant rockets that we utilize to escape Earth's gravity, so it is structurally the strongest portion of the vehicle. And then above that we have the liquid oxygen tank, which is the oxidizer, and that is a chemical element that we utilize to help the fuel burn in a specific way. And then just above that is the forward skirt, which is where a lot of the avionics and flight computers are housed. So the forward skirt communicates electronically to the engine section and back to mission control at Johnston Space Center to be able to direct the vehicle during flight.
From a technology standpoint, we have a much more rapid production rate available. We have a lot better machines to do the welding. I mean, our welds can be, near perfect. Like I said, with the additive manufacturing, you can build parts that you never could have built before affordably.
One of the key and critical pieces in really all space hardware systems is how some of our systems are joined. So the friction stir welding capability and technology has been infused to a greater extent in the Artemis and the SLS program than it had in any previous program. And one of the benefits of that specific fabrication technology is the strength that you maintain in those joint sections and the low likelihood of defects in that process.
The traditional welding technique, you would have 2 pieces of parent metal, which are joined by a filler material heated to a specific temperature. The friction stir welding process involves
the mating of only two parent materials, utilizing a pin tool, which is spun to a very specific RPM and travel speed. And as the tool travels through the two pieces of parent metal, those metals are actually blended into one another, as opposed to being joined using the filler material. The actual rocket itself, in terms of size, is assembled fairly simply, but it's putting everything inside of the vehicle that makes things quite complicated.
Long before a space mission is launched, the parameters of the mission must be calculated with the help of high-speed computers.
Think about what the technology was like back in the 1960s and 70s when we flew Apollo. Think about how much has changed in technology since then. There are things today that we have, capabilities we have. For example, the cell phone that you carry in your pocket has a lot more computing power than the original Apollo computers did. So the technology we have today is very different, and it makes it a very different approach with new materials, new avionics, new electronics, new spacecraft design techniques. All of those are different. So when we are doing these test flights, we're actually testing brand new spacecraft. Now, we build on the heritage from Apollo, but everything that we're doing on the Orion spacecraft, very different.
The computers that were used to launch the Saturn V, like the one that steered the Saturn V itself, like 120 megs, was nothing. It was wristwatch. And the computers that took us down to the moon were very small. That was a 93-pound setup built by Bendix. And the first one that took us to the moon couldn't keep up with the trajectory. That's why they overshot on that. On the next flight, they made a pinpoint landing. But that's the way they had commonly done it. Learn from their mistakes, and it rolls into the next one.
We're certainly more assisted by technology, and we hope to continue to be able to use as it develops. There's obviously a lot of interest in emerging technologies, artificial intelligence, things of that nature, and who knows what that'll bring for us in the future. But for the time being, it's the people that make these rockets work.
Road out to the pad isn't a divided highway, but two road beds filled with loose rock to help cushion the weight. When the crawler transporter is carrying the Mobile platform with the Saturn rocket, there is a total of 18 million pounds moving along at a top speed of 1 mile an hour.
Since the 60s, there have been a number of studies that have been done on how to get our launch vehicles to the pad. Other countries use different versions. We've looked at barges, wheeled vehicles, rail vehicles, a number of other things, and the crawler, a tracked vehicle, was always the best way to get there. So we did Apollo that way, we did some Skylab missions, we did a lot of shuttle missions, so here we are, still making this old vehicle work. It's a combination of a ship, a piece of mining equipment, and a locomotive. It has all those characteristics. We took ownership of it in 1965. We needed to get rockets from the VAB out to the launch pad, so this is the way we transport them. It's 131 feet long, 114 feet wide, weighs 6.65 million pounds. We are now in the Guinness Book of World Records as the heaviest self-powered vehicle in the world. We'd like to go just straight that way, but there were too many rivers in the way, so they kind of had to divert us and make some turns out there and stuff. So no, it's not straight. It ends up being about 4.3 miles out there. From door of the VAB to the top of the pad is 8 hours. When we're carrying the launch vehicle, we go 0.83 miles an hour. We can go a little faster, but we'll keep it right around that speed. Our speed is determined by the amount of vibration we create, because we don't want to vibrate so much that we shake the launch vehicle and cause it harm. We know if we go that speed, we give the smoothest ride to the launch vehicle. So that is always our goal.
As of right now, there is a red crew, as they are named, a specially trained team of individuals out at the pad making an unplanned change to a replenishment.
All of the emergency personnel available if we decide to proceed with the red crew. But it is not at all a plan. It's not a standard operation. It is a contingency operation.
It is pretty dangerous. When it comes to the ground system, our launch director makes that call, and she did on this call. Charlie Blackwell Thompson is the one who decided to send the red team out when they had a ground hydrogen leak on that, and she will be the one that ultimately calls any scrub, whether it's due to the machinery of the vehicle or from the pad or otherwise.
Hydrogen is a very small molecule and has been problematic even in the middle of the shuttle program. In 1990, we had, it was called the Summer of Hydrogen, where we had leaks. After operating the shuttle for 9 years, we still found difficulty getting past leaks. You have large interfaces to the vehicle. We had a number of cases where we had hydrogen leaks, and we needed to learn how to operate the vehicle.
The very thing that makes it hard to contain is the very reason that it's so good performing. It is the lightest and smallest molecule, and so when we accelerate this light molecule, we get very, very good, what we would call ISP, specific impulse, and to the layman, that's fuel economy. And so we take a whole lot less mass. You know, hydrogen was developed as a rocket propellant for the purpose of going to the moon, so that we could do it with one shot.
That's launch business. It doesn't matter if I work shuttle payloads, expendable launch vehicles, or human spaceflight. Everybody's launch business delays. Even if everything's perfect on the rocket, you can't control the weather. I worked Pluto New Horizons, which launched on an Atlas V, which was a tremendously exciting mission. I mean, it was sent a spacecraft to the outer solar system and was traveling 36,000 miles an hour. And I think it took 4 launch attempts. And I think maybe one was a launch vehicle problem. And then you show up at 3 o'clock in the morning and there's a storm. Or there's a ship or a plane out there somewhere that's not supposed to be there. Nothing you can do.
We also had to stand down for a hurricane. We actually stayed at the pad for a hurricane as well.
Oh, I got a little more airtime on that than I wanted to.
We had a hurricane on Thursday, and on the following Tuesday, we launched. And the vehicle stayed out there through the whole thing. Just think about that. Hurricane force winds here at the center on Thursday. Following Tuesday, we launched.
GC, go. Booster, go. Control, go. GNC, go. Prop, go. CDH, go. FIDO, go. FAO, go. MPO, go. ECOM, go. INCO, go. We'll go for launch.
At this time, I give you a go to resume count and launch Artemis 1.
We purposely build in a hold at T-minus 10 minutes so that we make sure we are absolutely ready, configured to pick up that clock from 10 minutes, because that means we are committed to fly that day. Vehicle sequencer, ALS, those 2 computers send every command to the ground systems and the flight systems starting at T-minus 10 minutes. So there's no human interaction for sending necessary commands in that entire 10 minutes. If nothing goes wrong, there are no violations through that entire 10 minutes. We're going to launch 10 minutes later. And for Artemis 1, that's exactly how it played out.
And here we go. Hydrogen burn-off igniters initiate. 7, 6, 5. 4-stage engine start. 3, 2,
ignition. And liftoff of Artemis 1. We rise together back to the moon and beyond.
The floor was vibrating in this room for that launch. It was massively different than any vehicle that I've seen launch from the Space Center in my career. Amazing demonstration of power. For us, as soon as the boosters light, our umbilicals separate, our command and control is complete. We can't command the vehicle anymore. That's the handoff point to the flight control team in Houston. And so there's nothing we can do to change anything. That's all done by Houston at that point. But it is still so important to us that we are that commitment to watching and hearing those words of, booster separation and main engine cutoff. We've been waiting a decade to hear those milestones. It is somewhat a level of relief. You do something for years, and then you finally get an opportunity to see it go through. I was very much impressed. My team does all the flight software as well as the integration of this rocket, and we had a flawless flight as far as software is concerned. You're nervous, right, when you see it go off. It reminded me of laying on the side of the road as a kid in 1969 and watching Apollo 11. So I had some emotions there with seeing that. I felt a certain level of accomplishment that we were able to do the things that we committed to do and deliver our commitment to going back to the moon and going to deep space.
Adventure, exploration, good engineering. It's a challenge. And of course, there's the moon and then Mars. And to some people,